Last year, Will and Jada Smith had a public conversation in which they talked about how their marriage was almost over, and it was at that time that Jada had an affair with a young rapper.
Yeah, I really felt like we could be over. We
were over.
Now, during the interview, Will seemed to be visibly hurt by the situation. But this year, he's expressed his contentment and his approval of it. In a recent interview with GQ magazine, Will talks about how him and Jada now have an open marriage where they're able to sleep with other people, and how for them, keeping the marriage open is the highest form of love. In this video, we're going to talk about what they claim the problem was in their marriage, how choosing an open marriage is supposed to solve that problem, how ironically I can relate to their problem, and why I came to a different solution than they did. Now, referring to their open marriage, Will said, "We have given each other trust and freedom with the belief that everybody has to find their own way, and marriage for us can't be a prison. And I don't suggest our road for anybody, but the experiences that the freedoms that we've given one another and the unconditional support, to me, is the highest definition of love." So what Will seems to be saying here is how they find their open marriage to be more loving since they've given each other permission to have sex with other people. Will has also been vocal about the fact that one of the key moments that led to their decision was when they came to realize that it wasn't their job to make the other person happy.
Jada and I realized that we were on individual journeys, and it feels so good to get to that space where you're not complaining and worrying and demanding that a person be a certain thing to sort of satiate your ego deficiencies, you know?
It is not your responsibility to make your wife happy, right? Just like it's not my wife's responsibility to make me happy. It's my responsibility to make me happy, and it's her responsibility to make her happy, and then we're gonna come together and build on that happiness.
I think from these interviews, and also from other interviews that we won't play here, we can start to not only understand what they understood to be the problem in their marriage and why they chose an open marriage as the solution, but we can also start to understand ourselves better when we find ourselves experiencing similar problems. Let me explain. So when I think about it, when you go all the way back to the beginning, it seems that Will and Jada started their marriage with an assumption that most of us millennials also have about marriage. And that's the assumption that marriage is fundamentally about happiness and being happy. As this situation starts to get played out, it goes something like this. It starts when we begin to date someone and we realize that they make us happy, and because our happiness is so profound, we decide that we want to marry them in order to secure that feeling of happiness. Now, of course, we expect to have some tough times here and there, but overall, we expect to be pretty happy. So when we start our marriage off with the assumption that marriage is ultimately about happiness, then we go into the marriage with the expectation that by getting married, the other person has basically signed up to have an overall happy marriage with us. But as the marriage goes on, the fairy tale starts to fade, and we find ourselves having more bad times than good. At first, we figure that it's probably just the season, but the bad times outweighing the good times starts to become the new norm. And that's the point where Will and Jada found themselves. And to some degree, they were fortunate to come to that point.
It's not my wife's responsibility to make me happy.
They were fortunate because they started to come to grips with the fact that if they decided to wait for their spouse to make them happy, then they may be waiting forever. The more that they relied on each other for their happiness, the more misery that they experienced. But it's what they chose to do with that realization that's the interesting part. So after they came to the realization that it wasn't their job to make the other person happy, they started to come to the conclusion that it was their own job to make themselves happy.
It's my responsibility to make me happy, and it's her responsibility to make her happy.
But from that conclusion, the next natural question is, how are they supposed to make themselves happy? You can only get so far by talking to yourself and trying to make yourself happy, so it would seem that the spouse could come in to help. But they already decided that they weren't allowed to go to their spouse in order to find happiness. So since they couldn't go to each other to find happiness, they both separately decided to go outside of their marriage and cheat in order to make themselves happy.
We decided that we were going to separate for a period of time, and you go figure out how to make yourself happy, and I'll figure out how to make myself happy.
It appears at a certain point, they finally decided to give each other permission to sleep with other people, and that they wouldn't stand in the way of each other's happiness, even if that meant sleeping with other people. Now, when it comes to me personally, me and my wife were in a similar position a few years ago. No, Not that we were in an open marriage, but that we too realized our inability to make the other person happy, and it drove both of us crazy. But as we grew in our faith together, I started to realize the benefit of being in a Christian marriage and how it actually helped to rectify that same issue. The more that my wife and I contemplated the message of the gospel and what that meant for our lives, we both started to slowly come to the realization that our expectations started to shift and that our ultimate peace and happiness and joy ultimately came from God. I realized that my joy and happiness and peace didn't come from my wife, but ultimately it came from a better understanding of who God is, how much he loves me, and what he did for me on the cross to demonstrate his love for me. And so when those inevitable times came when our spouse didn't have much to give for whatever reason, we were able to draw love from the source of love himself. I heard Tim Keller put it this way, and the way he punts it really resonates with me. He talks about how you can only give out large amounts of money if you have a different source of income that's paying you more than you're giving out. And likewise, if you don't have another source of money that's paying you well, then you won't be able to afford to be so generous with the money that you do have. You'll be more concerned with the amount of money that you're giving out, and you have to watch that money very carefully. In a similar way, this is how love is. You can be generous with your love only if you're getting an enormous amount of love from somewhere else. So in this sense, Will and Jada are right that you need to have another source of love in order to feel fulfilled in your marriage and to be in a position where you can give out large amounts of love to one another. But in a Christian marriage, that source isn't other sexual partners, since that won't ultimately satisfy you anyway. Instead, the source is the very source of love himself. And it's because of this that in a Christian marriage, marriage is not ultimately about happiness, but instead it's about the commitment to mutually agree to self-sacrificially serve one another, whether there's any feelings of happiness there or not. True love isn't just serving your spouse when they make you happy, but instead it's serving them self-sacrificially even when they don't. And this is made so much easier if you realize that your ultimate source of love is found in God rather than in your spouse. In the end, drawing your love from God will resolve that same issue while also being so much more fulfilling than having to result to being in an open marriage that most of us probably don't want anyway. Now, with that, there's so much more about this topic that needs to be said, including why agreements like open marriages and casual hookups or living together without being married and other things along those lines sound so tempting to us. But we'll save that for the next video. In the meantime, go ahead and check out one of these videos and I'll see you over there. But the next time that you find yourself going to your spouse for all of your fulfillment and not realizing that there's a far greater source, what are you gonna say?
You go figure out how to make yourself happy, and I'll figure out how to make myself happy.
What do you mean?